All right, so our next speaker is Justin Giboney. He is president and co-founder of the AND campaign. He was also a DNC delegate in 2012 and 2016. Justin, that might make you the closest thing to a politician here, so if you're angry at politicians, just yell at Justin. And then, Justin, you can go to Phil's why are people yelling at me? We got the whole thing going, yeah. He's also the co-author of Compassion and Conviction, the AND Campaign's Guide to Faithful Civic Engagement, which we have copies of as well. So let's please welcome Justin Giboney.
Let me rush, number one, to thank Nat for that introduction, and also for the invitation. I want to thank him and just the whole American Values Coalition for the invitation, and thank all of you for coming out. I don't take for granted that I've been asked to speak on a tough subject. I know Nap is a good steward of his influence and would only bring certain people to speak on that. So I take that very seriously and appreciate that you would do that. And I also want to kind of shout out the American Values Coalition for what it stands for. Standing by Christian principles, standing by the idea of peacemaking in these times is not easy. With partisanship and all that goes on with all our polarization, I think on both sides of the aisle, you get pushback for really trying to stand on those principles. So thank you and your team for all that you are doing. See friends like Dan Crane and others here, so it's just good to be here. I've been asked to discuss political polarization and race. As if one of those wasn't big enough, we're going to talk about both of them. And I think there's some connections between our shortcomings when it comes to where our democracy is right now, and our shortcomings also involving race. And this really, in a way, is the perfect moment to have this conversation, because I think the Harris versus Trump presidential race really has the potential to tear this country apart even more. As if we need it anymore, that I think the dynamics of this race have that potential. And so without us being deliberately neighborly as Christians and as citizens, I think it will bring out the worst of both sides of the political landscape. Because the stakes are high, and when the stakes are high, we often become blind to why civility matters, to why the American ideal matters. And so we need to make sure that we are not enslaved by this moment, that we can see outside of this moment with some moral imagination to understand what we should be doing and not just what's most expedient for us. And here's why I think this moment is so crucial, and why it just got a little more crucial, was that on Sunday, is because we were already polarized with two white male candidates, right? And now you have a black woman and a white man running against each other. And I think many of the wounds from the past that still haunt us in the present, that still linger in the present, will be ripped open. And I do believe that there are a lot of partisans and strategists and influencers that will also exploit those issues to get what they want, right? This is just my personal belief. I think MAGA does have a very serious racism and sexism problem. And I think you're going to see that on full display because of the dynamics of this race today. And whereas others, some on the left, may not want to admit any flaws with their candidate, and so they may blame those two things for any flaw that's going on. And so it's one of those issues where somebody has to bring some sobriety to the conversation. And I want to talk a little bit about how we can engage in a way that might be hopeful in doing that. But first of all, let me give you kind of a personal story that I think speaks into all of this. So my father worked at the Denver Water Department for about 30 years. And he started off as a meter reader, who would literally go from house to house just reading the water meters. And then he got an office job. And he was excited about this office job, but he was confronted with some resistance. Not everyone was welcoming or excited about his new prospects. In fact, the lady training him seemed determined to make his transition as difficult as possible, to complicate things, to trip him up as if to prove to him and others that he didn't belong. And in one instance, when he politely questioned an inconsistency in her instruction, she became irate, screaming obscenities and questioning his intelligence. It became clear that this was more than just a misunderstanding. Something deeper and more antagonistic was at play here. The tirade would climax with a physical assault. Swinging an open hand, she would literally slap my father in his face as he sat at his cubicle. Stunned and disoriented, this man from the ghetto of West Side Chicago somehow found the self-restraint to walk away. After all, he had a young family to feed. He eventually collected himself and went to human resources. But they had already been tipped off. And predictably, the power structure began to systematically form around the perpetrator because it was one of their own. He was given a half-hearted hearing where a panel void of his peers gaslit him and suggested that he was ungrateful for the opportunity he had so generously been given. In other words, know your place. He would have no internal recourse. The policies in place to prevent such an indignity lacked effect because some lacked the integrity to administer justice. And perhaps we're all inclined to choose partiality over just outcomes that would hold our kinsmen accountable. Either way, silenced and indignant, he decided to go to the office of State Senator Regis Groff, Colorado's second black state senator, a civil servant in the truest sense of the word. He recounted the story to the senator, and as my father's representative, Groff went to the office and held those in power accountable for what they had done. Now, I'm certain that he had other things on his calendar that day. He could have spent his time calling donors or dining with power brokers. There were no cameras, there was no compensation, nor any awards of recognition involved. And my father had no big campaign contribution to offer. He didn't have any political or social capital to barter. There was no influence to peddle, nor was there any type of quid pro quo to speak of. It wasn't part of the senator's formal job description. But Senator Regis Groff did it because it was right. Because he was a sworn representative of the people and had dedicated his life to advocating for the common man. And truth be told, I probably wouldn't be standing here before you if he hadn't taken the time to restore a sense of dignity in a man who had been mistreated and was silently struggling with alcoholism. A young man wondering if he had what it took to be a good father, trying to break a cycle of fatherlessness, succeeding and failing and succeeding to overcome the obstacles and temptations of the society around him, facing struggles of his own making and those of an institutional origin. That advocate didn't just bless one man, he blessed an entire family for generations. And if we think about it, isn't that story a testament to the genius of democracy? Isn't it an illustration of the brilliance of our constitutional republic? The idea that even the smallest among us deserves a voice, deserves an advocate. The wisdom to understand that none of us are fit to lord over others without the checks and balances of equal representation. What an exceptional idea. Equal representation, just representation in general. But don't take my word for it. I think the Bible has something to say about that as well. If we go to Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 through 11, it says this. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. The new king to whom Joseph meant, then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. In Exodus 1, we see what happens when a people is completely without a voice. When Joseph was alive, the Hebrew people were treated fairly, allowed to flourish and be fruitful. This is because those in authority recognized his contribution and respected him. Consequently, his people had an influential advocate. But when Joseph died and a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing stepped in, the Hebrews became nothing more than a threat. Political abstractions, markers on a war room strategy map. From Pharaoh's perspective, the destinies of the Egyptians and the Hebrews were not tied together. In sum, the Hebrews were no longer seen as neighbors. And to some extent, isn't that how we see our cultural and political opposition? Simply as people to be defeated and treated harshly. Historically, isn't this how racism works? Ideologically, we pretend the state or the nation would be nearly perfect if we could just get rid of all those conservatives or progressives and just make them disappear. But isn't that the same root of detachment, of self-interest and contempt that the new king had introduced? You see, when we read Exodus, I think we usually do so from the perspective of the Hebrews. But I'd submit that we all have some Pharaoh inside of us. And that this nation itself has been in Egypt to some. And the more we ignore our biases, the more we risk our power becoming our condemnation. The more our arrogance can turn us into exactly what we think we're fighting against. I call this the tyrant impulse. It's the temptation in every group and in every movement to silence or erase others, to unduly prevent them from pursuing different cultural and political ends. It's the urge not to win the debate, but to summarily end the debate through intimidation or force. The tyrant impulse is usually thought of as the tyrant is usually thought of as an individual authoritarian. But I would argue that it could also be a collective ideological tyrant, urging the state to do its bidding and punish its enemies. Those acting on the tyrant impulse can't tolerate cultural, political, nor social disagreement. Our ideologies can be tyrannical when they convince us that we're so right that we don't have to explain ourselves or don't have to endure opposition. That's also the way that racism works. This impulse, though, is in all of us. The question is whether or not we act on it. Those who don't deliberately extinguish the tyrant impulse in their camp rarely see themselves for what they've become, especially if they're upholding what they've honestly deemed to be a good cause. But I warn you, it's a misreading of history to say that what all tyrants have in common is an obviously malicious cause. Surely some do, but it's not the common trait. Some tyrants have championed what were initially good causes. What's common among all tyrants is not equal malevolence of cause, but the willingness to violate the human dignity of others to achieve their objectives. The willingness to promote narratives that make other groups appear to lack value and be unworthy of respect. A desire to crush institutions that amplify and take away the agency of others. Under the tyrant impulse, we can't simply say you're wrong, let me show you why. We have to say you're irredeemable and you have nothing to contribute. Those who succumb to the tyrant impulse have fallen for the age-old error of becoming evil to fight evil. But Jesus commanded us to see the inalienable value even in those who devalue us. Notwithstanding Newton's third law, the gospel disallows the equal and opposite reaction of contempt and vengeance. The tyrant impulse relies on compulsion instead of persuasion. So it is obviously incompatible with democracy. But it's even more so in conflict with the gospel. Humility, respect, empathy, and intellectual honesty are the things that dismantle the tyrant impulse. In the public square, we must all decide whether we'll be tyrants or neighbors and advocates. The Bible says if it's possible, so far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. And we ought to be peacemakers and take that task very seriously. And while I understand, and we have to do that while understanding that peacemaking can involve disagreement and friction. I'd be doing you a disservice by giving you a flowery message and then promising you that we could all just agree and then sing Kumbaya and live happily ever after. That's not realistic. There will be necessary conflict and tension when we have fundamental disagreements on life and death issues. We don't have to condone racial injustice or any kind of immorality to achieve fraudulent peace. This is not an ode to moral relativism or some romantic false equivalence. All opinions are not equal. Some of them are wrong and very dangerous. And I can't tell you to silence your convictions on those things. That's not what this is about. There are people who must be held accountable. Movements that must be vocally opposed. And ideas that deserve a very public and democratic death. What I'm saying is that even when in conflict, we still have to listen to others and refrain from trivializing their pain. And this isn't just something that has to be done by majority culture, although surely it does. This is a principle for everybody. The gospel allows all of us to be gracious and tenacious, to fight against evil, again, without becoming evil. My friend John Anazu calls this confident pluralism, standing on our convictions amidst deep difference while living respectfully and peaceably. But it's hard to be respectful when we believe that our side has all the answers and that the other side is responsible for all that is bad and evil. Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said that the line between good and evil runs not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through but right through every human heart. We don't have to agree with everyone, but we do have to love. Whether you are a Democrat or a Republican, whether you agree or not, it should break your heart that you see so many suicides and overdoses, deaths of despair in MAGA America. Regardless of where you stand, if you feel nothing about that, then maybe you should read Exodus from a different perspective. Part of the reasons we're so polarized is that we tend to overestimate our rightness and our righteousness. But the gospel gives us every reason to walk humbly in the public square, understanding that not all of our opinions are faithful applications of the Bible, but some of them are faulty conclusions perverted by self-interest and blind spots. There are issues the Bible addresses directly and clearly, and consequently, we can confront them with a level of certainty, but never with self-righteous arrogance. Jesus continually chastised those who, like the praying Pharisee, exalted themselves while condemning others. As I read the Bible, I see no indication that God's own people ever had all the answers or ever had a monopoly on good ideas and good works. They were often blessed by the insights of others and sickened by the fruit of their own understanding. God gave us the word, but he did not give any one group all the answers. We're broken. Our intellect is incomplete and can lead to destruction. Even our concept of love can be distorted. Think about it. Love for our own has often been treated as a justification for wickedness towards others. As leaders, we must reckon with our partiality and fear what it can do to those under our authority who don't have an advocate in our lives. What group, no matter right or wrong, lacks an advocate in your life? What group do you not see as a neighbor? We must rid ourselves of the false and arrogant notion that we or our ideological tribe are intellectual enough, altruistic enough to rule over others without their contribution. History continually disproves that proposition. I'm not going to say any names, but some of us come from an ideological tradition that opposed the civil rights movement. Others come from an ideological tradition that ushered in eugenics. Conservatives have yet to present us with a perfect meritocracy. Progressives have yet to prove that replacing God with autonomy can create their perfect utopia. Neither has proof of concept. We seek near absolute power for one side, but the truth is, none of us are fit to steward it. Let us acknowledge that reality and be humble as we address our neighbors, and seek solutions. Outside of interactions and relationships with representatives who see the gospel from other contexts, we have trouble understanding the word of God as full as it should be. We must strive to be neighbors and advocates for those who might least expect us to be that for them. Who could we surprise with our advocacy? Who could we surprise by truly being a neighbor? In Matthew chapter 6, verses 22 through 23, he uses the metaphor of the eye as a lamp. The healthy eye shines into the whole body. It guides the body in the proper way. Here, the eye symbolizes a sort of spiritual awareness, a sort of spiritual insight. This is our ability to perceive the truth, to see what God wants and to see his design clearly. Our eyes, or our spiritual insight, is the window through which the rest of our body receives direction. A healthy eye gives us an eternal perspective that shapes our understanding of truth, goodness, and a purpose. A properly focused eye leads to a healthy spiritual condition. A darkened eye leads to an unhealthy spiritual condition. This proverbial eye helps us determine what things we should value and what authority we should serve. Our eyes will be on what we value most. Consequently, our actions will be guided by what we value most. During debates about race and during this election season, we must ask ourselves continually, where are our eyes focused? There are those who are watching Kratos and his siblings, Nike and Bia. Kratos was the Greek god of strength. Nike was the god of victory, and Bia was the god of force, might, and compulsion. We serve them at the expense of charity, grace, and neighborly self-sacrifice. They ask, who is my neighbor? Other than a political abstraction to be defeated. These conflict with healthy race relations and a healthy democracy. When I listen to proponents of Christian nationalism, I don't hear worship of a God of justice and righteousness. I don't hear a faithful exposition of the gospel. What I hear is the ringing gong and clanging cymbal that exalt Kratos, Nike, and Bia. Here, the treasure is not the things of God, but apparently the treasure is cultural domination, political power, and the humiliation of our opposition. It's an eye blurred by belligerence. And above Kratos, Nike, and Bia, I think parts of the American church stay so deeply in this culture war posture because its eyes are set on Hybris. Hybris was the Greek god of pride. In Roman mythology, her name became hubris. Hubris is an extreme or unreasonable sense of pride. It's thinking too highly of yourself. Those whose eyes are on the goddess Hybris are blind. Well, sort of. They're blind to the racism and sins in their own culture, but they can see everyone else's sins very clearly. Their desire is to be better than other people, to be better than other countries, and to be better than others, and this has rendered them unable to see or acknowledge their own faults and the consequences and implications of those faults. We must all ask ourselves, are our eyes on Hybris or are our eyes on Jesus? Because today, everyone feels embattled. And as Christians and broken people, we need disciplines or practices that train us as reminders of the principles that we're supposed to uphold every day. For the civil rights movement, it was Negro spirituals that played this role in their lives even when they were on the front lines. They reminded them of what God demanded of them in tough moments when their knee-jerk reactions or their passions would have otherwise controlled their behavior. One song says, I got my hand on the gospel plow. Won't take nothing from my journey now. Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on. These lyrics are attributed to Alice Wine, a black domestic worker and civil rights advocate from Johns Island, South Carolina, born sometime around 1900. The name of the song, as I'm sure many of you know, is Keep Your Eyes on the Prize. You could say it became part of the soundtrack of the civil rights movement, a song, a theme song for gospel-centered advocacy. It was what they called a freedom song, sang at marches and demonstrations and at rallies in the face of hate and mortal danger. It was how the black ecclesial tradition brought church with them into the public square. The song was actually an adaptation of the song Keep Your Hand on the Plow, which was a plantation song. A song sang when faith was one's only survival mechanism, when the laws of the land were no refuge or no recourse, when judges lacked a commitment to impartiality, when elected officials chose to antagonize you rather than represent you. It was a reminder that you still had an advocate in Jesus and that the ultimate judge was indeed just. It says, heard the voice of Jesus say, "Come unto me, I am the way. Keep your hand on the plow. Hold on. When my way gets dark as night, I know the Lord will be my light. Keep your hand on the plow. Hold on." This signified that just like when they put their hand on the plow and it moved forward through coarse soil, the gospel moved forward through trials, toils, and snares. And God's eschatological plan moved forward toward the kingdom, circumstances notwithstanding. And they knew this, they could feel this, and they could believe it in the midst of a dark reality because their eyes were watching God. Both songs were faithful biblical expositions about the kind of sight and perseverance that all Christians are called to have in dreary seasons. It's blessed assurance that better things are not only possible, but forthcoming. It enabled one to acknowledge that the present reality was dim, but not dispositive. One's immediate line of sight couldn't be allowed to dictate the status of their hope. The cloudiness of the moment never diminished the promise. Hold on. Hold on, because God faithfully keeps his promises, even when governments and empires choose not to keep theirs. Where their ideas and principles are conditional, the word of God is reliable. The grass withers and the flowers fade, but the word of our God endures forever. Another freedom song continually repeats, "I'm going to treat everybody right until I die." How simple yet profound poetry. And it's simple, but it's profound when you consider the fact that they weren't just talking about people who blessed them. They were talking about people who bombed their churches and lynched their friends. It's a penetrating exposition about how those who are committed to seeing human dignity in everyone will somehow find the image of God in the most hostile manifestations of human brokenness. It speaks to how the only way to see God in someone who hates you is to see what's invisible outside of faith. You have to want to see it. Sometimes you have to be willing to imagine it in spite of their behavior and all other indications. And when you can do that, your civic engagement is worship. It glorifies God. It's the difference between wanting vengeance and wanting redemption for your opponents. And that can only be accomplished, again, when your eyes are watching God. Throughout much of American history, the message to Black America has been clear. No matter what you do, you will not prosper. If you build a black Wall Street, we'll burn it to the ground. If you raise up a leader, we'll kill him. And if you find solace in the sanctuary, well, we'll bomb that too. Everything that is brilliant and beautiful is the opposite of you. You have no history and you have no future outside of a thorough bleaching of culture and soul. And I would say that our best response to that has been not antagonism or militancy, not whitewashing or docility, not bitterness or vengeance, but rather a gospel-centered grace and tenacity. The faithfulness to love and the courage to fight righteously. In the midst of all this, black Christians were able to forgive. And if they could do all these things under those circumstances, then we too can do it for the good of our democracy. God bless you. Thank you.
All right, we have time for few questions for Justin. You answered them all, yeah. That.
Since you're here. Thank you so much for this. It was very enlightening and also just very thoughtful. So thank you for taking the time to think through some of these very complicated concepts and ideas. I really like the ending, how you started to point towards the Black American Protestant tradition. And I just want to hear more because, it was mentioned earlier that there aren't, the call for the pastorate, the call for churches is to give a theology of lament, right? And I think that there's a tradition of lament while also being a tradition of tenacity that you're pointing to. And if you could just kind of talk about the nuance of that, right? How black folks had to lament and just really kind of take in all the harm, the bombing of the churches, the lynching, the persecution, but also being tenacious and saying, Frederick Douglass, right, committed to seeing a democratic state while also completely thinking through religious concepts. So could you just talk about the nuance between the lament, but also the tenacity and belief in this democratic state, even when the state wasn't always gracious to those who was committed to it? Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think the beauty of the black church's social action tradition, which wasn't perfect, but I think one of the things that we can learn from it, especially in the midst of this culture war, is they never separated the spiritual from their social action. Right? There wasn't this false dichotomy, this false divide where I represent something in the public square and there's something different. They were together. They were one thing, right? And I think that's something that we can all learn because it forces us to really think through the Christian principles as we engage rather than kind of separating those from one another. And while I do agree that the church does need to offer a theology of lament, helping people understand what that means. That's right. I think the church definitely has something to say in the public square. I mean, for the black church, for a lot of African Americans, the black church was the primary economic center, political center, social center. It did all of those things. The leaders in the church for many years were the leaders in politics. I mean, there's some that would say, if there was a town where there weren't many lawyers, it would actually be a pastor for some black people that would be the one to go into court and to plead their case. That's saying a lot. And so while I do want to make sure that we're not allowing the church to be corrupted by politics or the church to be all political or just to say that the idea of the church is simply about social action. I think it's bigger than that. I think that's part of it. we have to understand that too many people today, when they make that false separation, what's leading them is an ideology, or what's leading them is a party, and all the things, the negative things that come into that. So, number one, from a practical standpoint, I don't think African Americans historically have had the privilege of separating the two. I actually think the civil rights movement was one of the greatest movements in American history because it didn't do that. Because it could look its oppressor in the eye and demand justice while at the same time not reciprocating the hate that it was receiving. That is a gospel-centered point of view. Because today, if we're going to be honest, part of what we feel is authenticity is showing our passion at all times. And if you really care about an issue, then that means you go out into the public square and you have your temper tantrum or whatever else, right? I mean, that's what we see as authenticity. That's not what they did, right? They went out there and they held themselves to a standard of dignity, right? They didn't just run out there and do whatever. They practiced people standing over you and people calling you names. They prepared for this, right? They had spiritual disciplines and they also had practical education on how to get through these things. Do we really take the time to do that? Have we ever really thought what it means to have somebody that wants you dead, wants you not to vote, wants your family not to grow, and to still not hate them? And that's why I say that tradition that you speak of is so important for this moment, because if they can do it, then if you're a progressive, you can do it for MAGA. If they can do it and you're conservative, then you can do it for Antifa or whoever, right? It doesn't mean that you don't oppose them, but it also means that you want their redemption more than you just want vengeance. And that's a big difference that I think that tradition brings to the conversation that we really just missed today. The other thing I would say is we have to keep in mind that as we advocate, being someone who's advocated for a long time, advocates can become very jaded because you're on the front lines, you're seeing all the stuff going down, and you can almost see it on your face. You become as ugly as the conflict. But I think what we have to remember is if we allow ourselves to be jaded as advocates, then the person who we're talking to, we're the representative of that issue. So if we're ugly, they see the issue as ugly. They don't see the child or the mother or whoever that's behind us that we're trying to advocate for. They see us. And so oftentimes we don't keep that right spirit. We do a disservice to the cause that we're fighting for. Because as I said during the speech, a good cause is never enough. A good cause has to be mixed with a good spirit. And we saw the disciplines again in the civil rights movement in that black church tradition to keep the cause pure, but also to keep the spirit of what you're doing pure. And too often we miss that. We think the good cause is all that matters. So thank you for that question.
Thank you so much for the provocation. I'm sitting with the tensions that you've highlighted, and then I want to name the tensions and then just ask for your thoughts on a reflection, if I could. I love the way the cultural read of the moment and the theological sophistication that you kind of unlayered that kind of plays out on both sides. The juxtaposition of trying to invoke God to have a high ground that then weds itself to a cultural position, weds itself to a politics. So I love the balancing. My thought is, in response to evil, when I think about the way in which we thought through the Civil War and the church's role, some of the reading leading up to the Civil War showed that pastors were not even dealing with the conflict of slavery and not even dealing with the concept of the justification of slavery coming out of the biblical text that then allows us to come to a theological problem that has to be fought on the battlefield. How would you help us to think through having the theological contestations that need to be had in order to confront evil, along with the social action. Because I agree with you that it can't just be the social action, but to redeem a people, you also are challenging a theological proposition about what God is.
Yeah.
And I hear you inviting us to think that through. So just, would you mind offering some thoughts of how do you think that could play out for us? Where could that happen? Is that a church proposition? Is it a community proposition? Is it a educational proposition like civic? How are you thinking about that?
I almost want to say all the above. I mean, there's certainly a place for that in the academy. I mean, we have to develop ideas, and not just ideas that only, certain people can understand, that people on the ground can understand, to make theology clearer, right? To really press people on that. When we go to people, it has to happen in churches, right? There has to be relationship. There has to be churches that we can come into and have those real conversations, whether it's a panel or a workshop and things of that nature, so that we can say, this is what the Bible actually says about this issue. One of the things I used to do, one of the mistakes that I made when I first got into speaking about this stuff, is I assumed number one, everybody knew the Bible, and number two, that everybody knew the true history of America. Christians. And I learned, sadly, they really don't. They really don't. And so I know a lot of people says, well, I'm sick of explaining, I'm sick of doing it. And maybe there's sometimes we got to step back and take time, but we have to have a level of patience with people too, to say, what if they really don't know? Because what I can guarantee you is there's some issue that I don't know everything about it that I should. And somebody can talk bad to me because I said the wrong word or whatever, or they can take the time to explain it to me. So whether it's the academy, whether it's in churches, whether it's in relationships, because we're all struggling with the human condition. We all have something that's going wrong with us. And one of the things that I dislike about part of the race conversation today, we think if we know somebody's profile, a certain profile lives almost a perfect, privileged life and nothing ever goes wrong with you. That's just not how things work, right? We can take somebody's identity and act like we know exactly everything that they've been through, but that's not true. And so we have to get to know people. We cannot, even if they do have more privileges than we have, even if they have been given more opportunities, we can't assume that they're not hurting and that we don't need to have a conversation with them to move forward. So I think that conversation needs to happen everywhere. And if we want to take it to its extreme, I mean, we talk about the Civil War. I mean, the Civil War became a war. Was it a war worth fighting? I would say so. Theologically speaking, I think we have to understand when war is necessary, right? Because you have some people saying, well, how do we fight evil when it's so bad? When do we know when the time to do it? I mean, we can go through, war theory and all that stuff, but that's what we all should know is that's not where we want to go. So I think we need to exhaust all other options to make sure that it doesn't happen, and building relationships to understand each other, but also building arguments, being able to debate these conversations. I'm not one of those people who believe that certain things shouldn't be said or certain things shouldn't be debated. If it's a bad idea, like I said, it needs a very public and democratic death. We need to talk about it. There shouldn't be ideas that we're scared to go against. I mean, think about Frederick Douglass. You brought up Frederick Douglass. He wanted to debate people who were pro-slavery because the merits of the case were on his side. And so anyone who doesn't want to debate a subject because it's too bad, I always am a little suspicious of that. Because if you have the merits and you've taken the time to create your argument, you should invite that conversation. And we don't always do that. But excellent question. I hope that was helpful. Excellent question.
All right, let's all thank Justin. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, Justin.